فيكم في المؤتمر السنوي الثالث للمتحف الفلسطيني تحت عنوان فلسطين إنتاج المعرفة إنتاج المستقبل. هذا المؤتمر بالشراكة مع دائرة العلوم الاجتماعية والسلوكية بجامعة بيرزيت، وكمان بالشراكة مع مركز مدى الكرمل المركز العربي للدراسات الاجتماعية والتطبيقية. قبل ما نبلش بس بحب أنوه إنه المداخلة الافتتاحية رح تكون في اللغة الإنجليزية، ورح يكون في ترجمة فورية وفي أجهزة الترجمة على الباب. أجهزة الترجمة صوتها عالي أظن برا القاعة، فإذا في حدا بحب ياخذ جهاز ترجمة نقدر قبل ما نبلش. تمام. بحب أنوه أن المؤتمر يرافق معرض المتحف الفلسطيني السنوي، معرض بلد محيط بالبحر، محطات من تاريخ الساحل الفلسطيني 1748 ل 1948. بحب أدعوكم من هاي المنصة تزوروا المعرض. أوقاته جميع أيام الأسبوع باستثناء يوم الجمعة من 9 ل 5. راح أترككم مع المداخلة الجلسة الأولى، راح يكون فيها الدكتورة عادلة العايدي هنية المدير العام للمتحف الفلسطيني بالافتتاح والترحيب، وراح يكون فيها المداخلة الافتتاحية التي راح يقدمها مشكورا الدكتور بشارة الدماني رئيس جامعة بيرزيت تحت عنوان سرديات المستقبل لتأريخ فلسطين.
صباح الخير، شكرا لحضوركم اليوم معنا وجاهين. احنا سعداء جدا انه عم نشوفكم وانه عم نلتقي فيكم في جامعه بيرزيت. احنا هذا المؤتمر السنوي الثالث الاول عقدناه. شكرا لحضوركم اليوم معنا وجاهين. احنا سعداء جدا انه عم نشوفكم في جامعه بيرزيت. احنا هذا المؤتمر السنوي الثالث الاول عقدناه. شكرا، هذا صباح الخير. قبل ما أعرف وأرحب بدكتور شهرية الدواني، بحب أعطي شوية سياق عن المؤتمر اليوم وعن وجودنا اليوم. أولاً إحنا كثير سعداء بالتعاون مع جامعة بيرزيت كالعادة، ومع دائرة العلوم الاجتماعية، وطبعاً مع مركز مدى الكرمل. المتحف الفلسطيني دائماً يتعاون مع هذا المؤتمر هو يقع في سياق الاستراتيجية الجديدة للمتحف الفلسطيني التي أطلقها قبل 3 سنوات، وبموجب هذه الاستراتيجية الجديدة نحن أطلقنا برنامج جديد دائم يركز على البحث والمعرفة، وهذا ضمن طبعا رسالة المتحف المتمثلة في إنتاج ونشر تجارب معرفية وحضارية عن فلسطين شعبا وثقافة وتاريخا، إذ أنه مع مطبوعات الفعاليات العامة والتربوية والعائلية والترفيهية والفكرية التي يقدمها المتحف كتجربة شاملة لجمهور داخل فلسطين وخارج فلسطين، الجمهور الفلسطيني ومن فلسطين، نسير في نهج إنتاج المعرفة في الجمع بين المعرفة التاريخية المحكمة والمادة الوثائقية الغنية وتدخلات فنية وتصميمية الوسائل. وبالتالي هذه الدائرة هي تقدم فعاليات فكرية على مدار السنة، أكاديمية أولا، ثانيا تقدم كما تعلمون منح بحثية. قدمنا أكبر عدد من المنح البحثية في مجال الثقافة العام الماضي، ونحن نتطلع إلى نشرها العام القادم مع نشر طبعا المنح البحثية التي قدمناها في المشروع البحثي الأول في متحف الفلسطيني وطبعا سننشر هذا المؤتمر في المنشورات المنشورة مع المتحف العام القادم. بحب لا يخفى المشكلة انه طبعا هذا ينعكس على نهج المتحف ووجه المتحف في روايات عن فلسطين. بحب اشير انه صورة صورة البوستر وصورة تخيل هي صورة للمصورة والتي هي موجودة مع مجموعتها الكاملة التي تبرعت بها مشكورة لمشروع الأرشيف الفلسطيني، مشروع الأرشيف الرقمي الفلسطيني. وهذه الصورة هي لشباب يشاركون في الانتفاضة الأولى في الشجاعية في غزة. طبعا المصادفة الثانية المحزنة بصراحة بحب أنوه لها هو وصلنا اليوم خبر وفاة الكاتب العزيز علينا الصديق حسن البكر. فبقدم حل تعازي إلى ذوي وأصدقائه ومحبيه، ونهدي هذا المؤتمر اليوم إلى روحه وإلى آخر كلمة بالنسبة لنا إلى السياق التعريف بالمؤتمر هو بحب أشكر الداعمين البرنامج البحثي والمعرفي للمتحف الفلسطيني وهم خالد وعمر القطان. فكل الشكر لهم اللي بفضلهم نحن نقوم بهذه النشاطات المعرفية والبحثية المواكبة لفعاليات المتحف. وطبعا لازم أشكر كل الزملاء والزملاء اللي في المتحف اللي بيعملوا بجهد وزي ما انتم شايفين لآخر لحظة لإخراج هذا المؤتمر. كل الزملاء وعلى رأسهم طبعا الزميلة فرح خليفة، فكل الشكر لكم. بالنسبة هلا أرجع للمؤتمر. المؤتمر عنوانه فلسطين إنتاج المعرفة إنتاج المستقبل. كمان ما بتذكر أنه هو موجود في رسالة متحف إنتاج تجارب معرفية حول فلسطين. يتركز المؤتمر حول أو يرتبط بسردية المعرض عبر قراءة الساحل الفلسطيني اليوم، معيدا موضوعاته ضمن السياق الفلسطيني الأوسع سياسيا واجتماعيا وثقافيا، ويربط واقعه ومستقبله بواقع فلسطين من البحر إلى النهر. وهنا يتجلى سؤال المؤتمر حول عملية إنتاج المعرفة الفلسطينية وعلاقتها بالخطاب التحرري المحلي والعالمي وممارساته. وطبعا نحن لم نجد أفضل من الدكتور شهرية الرئيس الخامس لجامعة بيرزيت لإلقاء الكلمة الافتتاحية بهذا المؤتمر. ونحن يعني في عندنا علاقة إضافية مع الدكتور شهرية، هو ليس فقط رئيس جامعتنا الحبيبة لكن هو كذلك من وضع الرسالة المفهومية والرؤية المفهومية للمتحف الفلسطيني. ربما تعرفوا أن المتحف الفلسطيني هو من أفكار المفكر الراحل الدكتور الله، وبسنة 1997 وبسنة 2010 أو 2011 الدكتور بشار دوماني وضع الرسالة والرؤية المفهومية للمتحف الفلسطيني اللي احنا نسير عليه إلى يومنا هذا. فاحنا شاكرين كثير للدكتور بشارة بوضعه الرؤية التي تؤثر بعمل المتحف قبل 11 سنة الآن، واللي احنا بدنا نبحث فيها اليوم أكثر بالتفصيل في هذا المؤتمر. دكتور بشارة مثل ما ذكرت هو الرئيس الخامس لجامعة بيرزيت، هو مؤرخ تتناول أبحاث الحياة الاجتماعية للأشخاص العاديين الذين أهملوا عن الدراسات والأبحاث التطبيقية السائدة، فكتب عن الفلاحين وصغار التجار والمرأة والحياة الأسرية في فلسطين ولبنان خلال العقد الثاني، ويكتب أيضا في سياسات وأخلاقيات إنتاج المعرفة. فشكرا دكتور بشارة. خلينا نشوف إذا تقدر تتفضل ولا لا. بس 5 دقائق.
للأسف اليوم بدي أعطي محاضرة بالإنجليزي، ما كان عندي وقت كثير حتى معي بالعربي فكان حيكون عندي وقت أكثر بكثير من هيك، بس آخر أسبوع أسبوعين كانوا شوي ضاغطين. فكتبت أشياء سريعة بالإنجليزي، ملاحظات أولية، ولكن رح نطورها. الكتاب رح يطلع بعد شهرين 3 إذا مش أكثر. طبعا بكل سرور أنا بستعد للنقاش أي نقطة أو تحب أعالجها أكثر خلال الكويشن أند أنسر بيريود. فهلا رح أبدأ بالإنجليزي. I want to thank Adila you for the invitation, and also Inas Yassin for a private tour of the exhibit with an eye to not just content, but the process of production itself, which I think is very important. Thank you all for attending, and I'm deeply honored to be included among this excellent group of speakers for this conference. Like I said, it's been a difficult 2 weeks, very busy, and hence not only the decision to speak in English and give an initial set of reflections, but also not to provide you with a clear, specific argument. And I thank you in advance for understanding. The concept paper for the conference, Palestine, Producing Knowledge, Producing Futures, asks, how do we, in the context of the Nakba as an ongoing central colonial structure of destruction, dispossession and displacement, can we read Palestine, and how do we research it? How do research methodologies produce and reproduce Palestine? Setting aside for the moment that the title of the conference and the questions asked focus on Palestine and not the Palestinians. And here I can talk about in greater detail later how I think that the concept of Palestine and the concept of Palestinians don't actually mesh together very nicely. They are often in tension with each other. I can talk about that later, because I think that the history of the Palestinians far exceeds the history of Palestine. And at the same time, the history of Palestine far exceeds the history of the Palestinians. But putting that aside, these questions that are posed by the conference concept paper assume, and rightly so, that historical narratives are present, informed, and future-oriented. Simply put, writing the past is a process of inscribing the future. To write Palestine and the Palestinians into history is a precondition for both a Palestinian nation and a Palestinian state. Power and ideological struggles about what should happen in the future, therefore, deeply inform the kinds of questions we ask about the past. This is why the past is a constantly contested terrain between modes of knowledge production that privilege or silence, center or marginalize. This is basic ABCs for historians. Now, the relationship between knowledge and power in writing the past can most clearly be seen in what I call the architectures or configurations of time/space/agent. How time, space, agent are configured in studying the past is how they construct futures. That is, the complex web of relations between narrative and power that produces areas of visibility and invisibility in the fabric of the past always do so through the three-dimensional triangulation of these three things: time, space, and actor. And by actor or agent, I don't mean necessarily human, but for most people, they assume it's a human agent. The question is, what narrative architectures or configurations of time, space, and agent have the potential not only to humanize and tell empirically robust stories about Palestine and the Palestinians, that is to write them into history in a historicist sense, but can also de-exceptionalize and globalize that history so as to exceed, to subvert, and to provide an alternative to colonial frames of knowledge production. We must ask of any narrative, what are the political intellectual stakes or claims and possible futures that are opened or foreclosed by these different configurations? And is there a history for these configurations? Can we see different architectures over time that produce different futures or simultaneously? These larger questions are examined in this brief talk through reflections on the current exhibition, that focuses on Palestinian coastal cities in terms of space, begins in the mid to late 18th century in terms of time, and posits Dahr al-Umar as a founding figure of an indigenously driven modern historical transformation that was violently aborted in 1948, and that is the agent, or one of the agents. My argument is very simple about the history of the Palestinian futures that are embedded in narratives about the past, and that is what we are witnessing now, and this exhibition is a good example of that, is a return of the coast and of Dahr al-Umar in the same way that we have a return of the studies of settler colonialism in the academy. The interest in Dahr al-Umar and the coast peaked and really flourished in the 1960s and 1970s, died off, and then after people lost hope about Oslo, and especially after the Second Intifada, were revived again. And there's a set of historical reasons for that have to do with the rise and demise of the second phase of Palestinian nationalism, and now the death throes of the third phase of Palestinian nationalism. And knowledge production is impacted or reflects in many ways these larger historical developments. But first, let's talk a little bit about unlearning history. That is to say, allow me a brief word about the writing of history in general. Modern historical practice is in many ways a deeply imperialist practice. As members of one of the earliest and most powerful of the modern academic disciplines, historians played an important role in the cultivation of specific time-space agent narrative architectures or storylines that were productive of imperial conquests, settler colonial projects, and the nationalist identity/territory/sovereignty matrix on which modern political orders were built. For example, political Zionism as a national movement of sorts constructed a past that legitimized the political claims of the movement based on the categories of land, people, nation, through a linear progression of historical time. And so has the Palestinian national movement done something similar, of course, in opposition. But both, in many ways, exist within the colonial framing of the past, epistemologically speaking. An added layer of complication faces those who work not on the West, but on the rest. The notion of a temporal rupture caused by the encounter with the West is so pervasive that it has imprinted the very institutional development of fields of knowledge production about the other. In terms of imposing its own physics of time and space, this encounter is akin to the inescapable gravitational pull of a black hole, within which space collapses and beyond which no light, and light is the ultimate metric of time, can escape. It is no exaggeration to say that almost all historical work in Middle East, Islamic, and Ottoman studies, at least in the United States and much of Europe, regardless of approach, methodology, topic, or time period, revolves around the event horizon of this black hole. This has created enormous zones of invisibility with profound intellectual and political consequences, of course, that the Palestinians know very well. Now, this is not to say that all constructions of the past, for example, that are nationalist inclined are the same, obviously not. This is not to say that there are no differences between an anti-colonial rendering of the past and a colonial rendering of the past, obviously not. But I'm talking here about the epistemological vocabulary in which these kinds of constructions are made possible. How can we exceed the colonial frame by focusing on times, places, and agents who have been erased or marginalized in dominant practices of knowledge production? This is a major concern for the Palestinians, of course, because their history has always been the subject of a colonial conquest as well, and it's been erased or marginalized. Now, in this particular exhibition, there are a focus really on of course, 1948 period, going back 2 centuries in time. So at least 2/3 of it are for the Ottoman period or pre-colonial period in some ways. And the station stops are Dahr al-Umar and the rise of Acre, the Tanzimat and the rise of Jaffa, the growing European influence, the Mandate period, and the Nakba. Now, the focus on an indigenous figure, Dahr al-Umar, and the pre-colonial period drive home the point that Palestinian society is not just the product of settler colonialism. Rather, it has its own history, the most important aspect of which is relationship to the land, something which from the mid-18th to the mid-19th century. And it ends with stone, to a certain extent, through a terrific installation of tiles, broken tiles that were recovered from the ocean and the sand, of Palestinian houses that were destroyed. And these tiles were put together in the form of a city of Jaffa. So you end with a building of stone, and you end with the destruction or ruination, which is a classical theme in Palestinian history, also of stone. The beginning, that is to say time, of course, is in many ways the most important. Where do we begin any history or any narrative or producing knowledge of the past about Palestine and the Palestinians? Edward Said became famous because of a book called Beginnings, actually, in which he theorized the rise of the novel and in many ways the rise of history as a modern kind of action, as a frame of mind, as a kind of work, as an attitude, as a consciousness. These are his words. Through that book, he introduced Foucault really to the United States and became famous as a literary critic. And his point is very simple. Where you begin is in many ways a product of power. Each beginning determines the middle and endpoints. Now, in the case of Palestine, of course, we have many possible beginnings telling narratives about the past. The most popular, though the least academically discussed, is of course a religious kind of beginning. It's popular in consciousness of most people in the world. It's popular in films and public discourse, not so much in academic writings. That is to say, the Bible is a real estate agency, and the answer to who comes first is a struggle between, of course, the First Testament and the Canaanites. So the indigenous answer to the Zionist claim of being the chosen people for the land of Palestine is to say we were there first. We were the Canaanites. This is a race to the past that the Palestinians, of course, can never win. But there are, of course, other early religious beginnings. Of course, the question of Jerusalem and Dome of the Rock is central to that, and politically so, as we saw this year as well, and as we see again and again. And if one digs into family histories in Palestine, almost every important family says our ancestors came with Salah ad-Din, because he kicked out the Crusaders and we were with him and we helped in that. And we trace our lineage back to the groups of people that fought together with Salah ad-Din. I think if you look at the major families in Nablus and Jerusalem and elsewhere, many of them have their starting point right there. and are very proud of it. And that has a religious kind of reading of what a beginning is. So this is very different, of course, from beginnings that really are concerned about the question of modernization, modernity, or the modern. They have different meanings, but let's put them all together right now. These are, of course, have to do with how the modern came to the Middle East. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 is the most popular starting point for histories of Middle East thought in the United States and elsewhere. 1831 is key beginning for a writing of Palestinian history, because the idea is the Egyptians were infected by the virus of modernity in 1798 by Napoleon, and they carried this virus to Bilad al-Sham through the Egyptian invasion of 1831 and introduced many of the ideas and many of the structures of the modern state and modern philosophy of politics, etc., through their occupation, which lasted 9 years until 1840. There are numerous books on Palestine that begin with 1831. There is, of course, 1882, which gives the agency to the beginning of Zionist settlement in Palestine. That is when the real history begins. The most famous and most widely read book on Palestinian history for a long time was Kayali's book on the modern history of Palestine, and it begins in 1882. And it makes clear that this is the moment things change. And we are who we are because of that moment. Of course, there are some that would begin in 1917 and so on. All of these are political, in many ways, starting points that determine what kind of story we can tell. And then for the most cases, all the ones that I just mentioned don't have a place for the Palestinians. They are not the center of the story. What kinds of questions or beginnings can we think of that actually put Palestinians at the center of historical narrative? Zahir al-Omar is one such possibility. A native son, started off as a tax collector near Tiberias, ended up as a, choose your word, Zaim, Ra'is, Iqta'i, the head of a state within a state, a somewhat autonomous region stretching from Tiberias to Acre, from Nazareth to South Lebanon, and the expression of which is his building, of course, of the wall of Acre. And the Acre becoming Akka, the capital of the state, which was kept alive economically through controlling or monopolizing the production of certain goods, especially cotton, for sale to the West. Akka was the beachhead in that sort for the trade. And through a shifting set of alliances with the British, the Russians, the Mamluks of Egypt, and so on, that allowed him to fight back Ottoman attempts to regain centralized control of that region. He's a local boy that did good. Now I want to say something about that in a little bit more detail. Exactly 40 years ago, I started teaching at Beirzeit University and met my future wife here, and now here I am back. And 41 years ago, I finished a dissertation written in large part as an alternative to this narrative about coastal cities and Zahir al-Omar. I was very unhappy with that narrative. It criticized this dissertation, the overwhelming focus of scholarship on Palestine, which until that point was obsessed with the coast and the rise of the three cities chronologically, Acre and then Jaffa and then Haifa. Somehow Gaza keeps getting forgotten. as beachheads for the rise of the modern Middle East, along with their larger cousins, Izmir, Beirut, and Alexandria. If you look in the production about the history of the Middle East for that period, it's all about the coast and it's all about the cities. And that went on for a very long time. My generation, in a way, tried to resist that. The scholarship was also obsessed about finding historical figures who can be seen as heroic founding fathers of nations fighting against the Ottoman Turks. The most famous, of course, is Muhammad Ali Pasha of Egypt, the supposed founder of the Egyptian state, Amir Bashir, the founder of Lebanon, and so on and so forth. For those interested in Palestine, the focus was on Zahir al-Umar. And about a dozen books and articles written about him in the 1960s and the 1970s. For Israeli scholars who led the scholarship, he was a local partner of Western imperialism that facilitated Western quote-unquote penetration and the decline of Ottoman Empire through these allegiances and the halafat that he did with all these other forces, Russians, British, French, Mamluk leaders, and so on and so forth, which eventually transformed in order to have his own little state, which eventually transformed Palestine and made it ripe for Zionist settlement. They used mostly European and Ottoman sources as well as local chroniclers to write that history. But there were also Palestinian writers who wrote about Zahir al-Umar. Ahmed Hassan Judah wrote a dissertation in the 1960s at the University of Michigan on Zahir al-Umar, which was published as a book, I think in 1987. I reviewed that book the same year I finished my dissertation in 1990, and it was republished again 30 years later, which is exactly my point about how something becomes popular and then it dies and then it becomes popular again. And there was also a local book written by Tawfiq Muammar al-Muhami in 1979, which I like very much because it used almost all oral history to write about Zahir al-Umar, basically how he still lives on in the local memory of Palestinians through poetry and zajal and built environment and so on and so forth. And both books, unlike the Israeli scholars who wrote about Zahir al-Umar, and these included the former president of Israel, Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, it included one of the leading German-trained kind of historians, Amnon Cohen, and others at the Hebrew University, Gabriel Beer, and so on. The Palestinian ones that wrote about Zahir al-Umar looked at him not as a feudal lord who collaborated with forces outside of the Ottoman Empire to build a kind of a private state, but rather a nationalist hero that proved the existence of the Palestinian people and of the Palestinian state within a territory that would become known as Palestine under a British mandate before the Zionist movement claimed this area as their homeland. Now, like I said, I wrote a review of Judah's book about 41 years ago, 30 years ago, back in 1990, 31 years ago, in which I think harshly but honestly complained that the focus on this person was yet another brick in the wall of nationalist constructions of the past that reinforced colonial framings of our history, and that the focus on his story of state building preempted a possible story about the society in which he lived. It was a form of erasure of the Palestinians by focusing on the Palestinian national hero. The same, of course, would be argued in many, many books about Muhammad Ali Pasha and Amir Bashir and all these other people by a generation or two of scholars who wrote in the 1990s, early 2000s, 2010s, terrific set of younger scholars, of which we have some in Beirzeit. Now, like I said, Dahr al-Omar's star faded after the 1970s, as did the interest in the Galilee, as did interest in life inside the Green Line for the Palestinian national movement, and especially during the first, let's say, 10 years or decade of Oslo. But after the first Intifada, a great disillusionment with the possibility of a two-state solution, demise of the second and third phases of the national movement, everybody's eyes started turning back to the Galilee and back to Dahr al-Omar. The coast, and I think was deserving of a lot of scholarship in the middle period, and I'm glad it's back. There's a lot of terrific scholarship now on the coast, and it's very important politically, of course, for us to know that not only that history of that space or of that person, but also to be reconnected to what inside the Green Line, as they say. And I think the power of the exhibition is that it creates a way of connecting to that past and to that space and to that person that is far more powerful than any of the recent books, including Philip's book on the rise of Acre, which I think is terrific and should be read by all. This has, of course, moved along the same lines as commemoration politics for the Palestinians. For a long time, the key commemoration was the Battle of Karami. It's no longer commemorated. 1948 was not commemorated for a very long time, until fairly recently. And there's a reason for that. By commemorating 1948, we are saying that in many ways, this is where the real focus of our attention should be, not on how to create a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, but how to create a state that has a true right of return for all its people. I was not keeping track of the time. 5 minutes? Okay, I'm going to skip right now, but it'll be in the paper or in discussion. My overview of all the different literatures that happened in these 40 years in between the rise of Dahr al-Omar, his demise and his rise again, and what this new scholarship is telling us, what kinds of new futures it opens up for the Palestinians. And I will just become a little bit philosophical about the conclusion of the review of this literature. And I would like to be philosophical about it by looking at Mahmoud Darwish's famous poem about Edward Said, because in it he asks, what is the future if I die before you, what would you say? He says, and Edward Said in the poem answers, my will is the impossible. And here I'm referring to the question of, is a Palestinian future possible? And what do we mean that the future is impossible? I would like to give 3 possible answers to that claim by Mahmoud Darwish through the mouth of Edward Said on the question of time, especially, but also space and agent. This configuration or architecture of the past. First is about the impossible and temporality and time. The future is already here. And what is our response to that future? We can see the future every day through all sorts of practices, both by the Israelis and by ourselves and others. Every decision we make every day in our daily life is about creating a particular kind of future. And that future seems impossible because there's a disparity in power relations that is so huge, so vast, that one can hardly imagine that things will fundamentally change in one's lifetime. In fact, the poem asks again, when will that future be, if it's a possible future? And Edward Said in the poem supposedly answers, in a generation. That is to say, a generation after his death. That is to say, the impossible could be possible, but not in our lifetime. I think in many ways that is an illusion. I think things can change very quickly, and we should not just be waiting until the next generation. I can get into that during discussion and answer, but the real point I'm trying to make here is we must dare to imagine now, through our actions every day now, how we build the future now. Just because it feels and looks impossible doesn't mean that things will not change very quickly, and they will. And are we prepared for these changes? Are we building the kind of society we want to live in now? The second answer to my reading of the impossible has to do with agency, or the person, or and this is also a kind of impossibility. The Palestinians cannot be free until the whole world is free. That's what it feels like. The Gordian knot of the Palestinian condition is one that cannot be broken by one state or one people or one event. And the Palestinians are certainly not the strong party that can do so by themselves. The Gordian knot of the Palestinian condition is deeper than just one solution or one agreement. There's something so fundamentally deep about the Palestinian condition that for them to be free, the whole world has to be free. And it seems impossible.
من المعرض. هذه نقطة البداية مهمة جدا، وأنا ما بظن إنه أكيد إنه المعارض القادمة اللي رح نعملها واللي في وصف إلها بالمنشورات رح تبلش مع ظاهر عمر، بس ممكن تبلش بفترات أقدم أو أجدد، مش عارفين. اللي بحب كمان أركز عليه بخصوص الايجنسي عودة إلى المعرض. أنا شخصياً كتير مهم إلي إنه الناس لما تيجي على المعرض تنتبه. في المدخل في عنا 3 شاشات فيديو في المدخل، كتير مهم إنه الناس تشوفها. في عنا كذلك شاشات، في شاشتين عدنا إحياء وعدنا الحركة لصور لقرية الطنطورة قبل وبعد المجزرة، إضافة إلى أول صور لإنشاء مخيم المغازي. إيش بنشوف إحنا بهاي الشاشات؟ بنشوف الإنسان الفلسطيني، نشوف الإنسان الفلسطيني كيف شكله، شو كان يعمل في النبي روبين، كيف عاش الطنطورة. هذه فقط من خلال الصور الفيديو اللي هي وثائق نادرة، إحنا كتير مبسوطين إنه حصلنا عليها. ثم في عندك كل المحطات اللي بتركز على الإنسان وإنجازات الإنسان الفلسطيني. وهون عشان أكمل بدي أربط في كلمة ذكرتها أو جملة ذكرتها دكتور بشارة في الورقة المفاهيمية كمان مرة للمتحف، للإطار المفاهيمي للمتحف، إنه في روايتنا للتاريخ بالتركيز على ما يقوم به الإنسان، ما قام به الإنسان الفلسطيني، إحنا بنعطي، خليني أستعمل هاي الكلمة، الأمل، أو نعطي أمثلة إنه ما قام به الإنسان الفلسطيني في السابق يمكن أن يقوم به الإنسان الفلسطيني حالياً وفي المستقبل لصناعة المستقبل. فهذا اللي أنا بشوف الإيجنسي، موضوع الإيجنسي. وشكراً دكتور بشارة لهذا التحليل وهذا التذكير. بعرف إذا بتحب تعلق قبل ما نفتح الباب للأسئلة.
بس كلمة صغيرة لو سمحتي لي. أنا أكتر إشي، يعني أول إشي لازم تشوف المعرض، لأن كل جزئية من المعرض بتحكي عن الإنسان. أنا بقول مهمش، يعني في كتير شغلات موجودة بالمعرض اللي بتبني هذا المفهوم اللي أنا بقول إنه ضروري يكون موجود. كل إشي من صور اللي انت ذكرتيها والفيديو، بس من الشغلات يا ريت تقدروا تشوفوها، يا ريت في فيديو لها، هي البرفورمانسز اللي انعملت. انا لقيتها انه كانت it was a brilliant idea. انا حضرتها. ما بعرف اذا شفتوهم، بس اول ما تدخلوا على المعرض بالافتتاح كان في
عامر حلاحل كتب النصوص، وعامر رح يكون معنا اليوم العصر.
it's brilliant. من الشغلات اللي نحن ما بنفكر فيها كثير كأكاديميين، بس موجودة بالدي ان اي تبع الفلسطيني كونديشن، انه الناس اول يعني من 47 ل 48 ل 49 هي فترة طويلة، بس أكثرية الناس بفترة 48 واجهوا سؤال كثير صعب: بنبقى أما بنقاتل أما بنهرب، ومين مع ومين ضد، وكيف هذا فرق من ناحية الجندر، المرأة والرجل، لأن احنا بنعرف إنه كثير بالحالات الرجال كانوا بيطلعوا والنساء كانوا بده يقعدوا، وفرقت بين الجنريشنز. وانطرح بهديك اللحظة الحاسمة أسئلة وجودية للشعب الفلسطيني، مين هم، إيش بدهم، شعارتهم مع بعضهم البعض، لليوم بعدين نحاول نجاوب عليها. يعني كانت لحظة حاسمة. وأنا سررت جدا وقت دخلنا على افتتاح المعرض أول ما بلش، إنه صار في نوع من المجادلة، ما فيك تسميها حتى طوشة، ما بين الأب والابن والأم. وأنا برأيي it was unbelievable يعني حقيقة، وأعطى زخم بالضبط اللي أنا بحكي فيه قبل شوي للإكزيبيشن. وهي بس واحد من عدة performances. واحدة منهم مثلا الثانية كانت عن بين رجل ومرأة تزوجوا من جديد وبينقلوا من القرية للمدينة، وقصة الهجرة من القرية للمدينة، خصوصا نشوء حيفا بالأخص، قضية كتير كتير مهمة بتاريخ الفلسطيني، عادة ما بتنحكى. وطرحها هذا البرفورمانس بشكل كتير قوي إلى آخره. ف أنا كل إعجاب حقيقة بالبحث وبعرف إنه صعب كتير الواحد يعمل برودكشن لقصة، يعني مليون إشي بيكون حابين يعملوه بيقدروش لأن أسباب عديدة فنية وإلى آخره. بس قصة البرفورمانسز أظن كمل العمل كتير جبار اللي قاموا فيه عشان يحيوا الشعب الفلسطيني بهذيك المرحلة، و200 سنة مش بسيطة.
اوكي، شكرا كثير دكتور فعلا. خلينا نشوف اذا في اسئله. بظن عشان ضيق الوقت بدنا ناخذ 3 اسئله. خلينا ناخذ 3 اسئله ورا بعض وبعدين بتجاوب عليهم مره واحده. يلا.
تحياتي واحتراماتي للجميع. محمد علي باشا بعد أن زاد سلطة وسلطانا كان له تطلع توحيد مصر مع بلاد الشام، وهذا كان هدف حملة ولده إبراهيم باشا التي دامت 9 سنوات. ولكن عندما شعرت الدولة العثمانية بأن محمد علي باشا على وشك أن يطرق أبواب الآستانة استعانت ببريطانيا ووضعت حدا لذلك. نفس الشيء ينطبق على ظاهر العمر. بعد أن زاد سلطة وسلطانا استعانت بأحمد باشا الجزار الذي لقب بذلك لكثرة ما أطاح من رؤوس، ومن بينها ظاهر العمر الذي علق جثته طويلا بعد أن ملأها تبنا وقشا. ما هو تعليق بروفيسور دكتور بشارة على ذلك؟
Okay, I guess you said everything. No, I said okay. تفضل.
اوكي، بالبدايه بدي اقول شكرا على المعلومات القيمه اللي سمعناها. اذا بتسمح لي دكتور دوماني استفسر شوي على السؤال الاول، هو كيف بالامكان كتابه التاريخ الفلسطيني. واذا انا فهمت شوي التفاصيل غنيه، وأنا يعني استفدت منها، بس الاتجاه العام شوي أنا حابة إذا بتقدر توضح لنا إياه، توضح لي أنا إياه، يمكن مش واضح. كأن الاتجاه العام لكتابة التاريخ هو أنت قلت، يعني إذا بقدر أقول، هي to exceptionalize knowledge